end, but we'll get started. And good evening, everyone. I'm Cathy Blake, Director of Campus Planning and Design and the University Landscape Architect here at Stanford. Welcome to the last lecture in Stanford's Spring Lecture Series in Architecture, Landscape Architecture, and Urban Design. This year, The Architecture of Joy. In his book, The Architecture of Happiness, Alain de Botton writes, "It is perhaps when our lives are at their most problematic that we are likely to be most receptive to beautiful things." That point was proven in March 2020 when many of us began sheltering in place in an attempt to flatten the curve. As we continue to emerge from this pandemic, let's reflect together on the incredible value of architecture in our lives. Our environment brings us joy, inspires us, and reminds us of our full potential, both individually and as a community. With that sentiment in mind, we invite you to sit back and relax and enjoy the inspirational work of our talented speaker. Before we begin, I want to thank the rest of our team who helped organize the series. The University architect Dave Lennox, Zach Posner, and Padma Kadidapudi, along with Krista Van Hove from the University Architect's Office, and the Director of Stanford Architectural Design Program, John Barton. I'd also like to thank the American Institute of Architects, Silicon Valley, for advertising the series and registering our program for continuing education. At the end of the lecture, your attendance will be automatically noted and submitted to AIA. Thank you, too, to the Northern California chapter of ASLA for their support of this program. The protocol for today's webinar is we have allotted 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the lecture for questions and answers. Please use the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen to post any questions you might have during the lecture. Krista and I will group similar questions together and we'll present them to the speaker as time permits. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Sara Zewde. Sara is the founding principal of Studio Zewde, a design firm in New York City practicing landscape architecture, urbanism, and public art. The studio is devoted to creating enduring places where people belong. Named to Architectural Digest AD 100 and an emerging voice in the Architectural League of New York, the firm is celebrated for its design methods that sync culture, ecology, and craft. In parallel with practice, Sara serves as Assistant Professor of Practice at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. She and I together also serve on the school's Alumni Council. Sara was named the 2014 National Olmsted Scholar by the Landscape Architecture Foundation, a 2016 Artist in Resident at the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation. In 2018, she was named to the National Trust for Historic Preservation's inaugural 40 Under 40 list, and in 2020, she became a United States Artist Fellow. Sara holds a Master of Landscape Architecture from Harvard Graduate School Design, a Master of City Planning from MIT, and a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Statistics from Boston University. So now, please give a warm welcome to Sara Zewde.
Thank you, Cathy, and thank you all from Stanford for inviting me virtually to take part in this lecture series, and for the great prompt of the Architecture of Joy. The titling and the prompt of the series has offered me some new reflections and thinking about today, about this evening conversation we might have. So thank you for that. And we can get into it. So a little bit of background. I am originally from the Gulf Coast of the United States, from Texas and Louisiana. And it was this storm event of Hurricane Katrina that really prompted my professional journey through sociology and statistics and city planning, and then ultimately urban design and public art, which I practice now. And it was the aftermath of this event that really prompted my reflections on ecology, on politics, on infrastructure, on aesthetics and culture, and how we build the places that we live in. And the ways to understand all of the factors that could prompt a Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath, and ways in which we might intervene in that. And so now I'm principal of Studio Zewde, which is a full-service landscape architecture and public art practice based in New York City on Lenox Avenue in Harlem. So when the world, is fully open back up, feel free to swing by our offices. We describe our design methodology as being powered by site interpretation, cultural narrative, and a dedication to the craft of construction. And what that means is that we invest in a pretty robust, process of research, of engagement, of understanding places and the people that live there. And we do so not for the ends of just a story to tell or interesting observations, but we really believe sincerely that there are innovations in the way that we design and build places that can come from those understandings. And so that, that process of research and engagement doesn't end. It is woven into every step of design, of documentation, and ultimately of construction. So, we don't have a details library, for instance. We really feel that the way in which places are made, materials are expressed and come together, those decisions are important, and they ultimately make a place feel like it belongs and people feel like they belong. So this methodology has allowed us to practice at a really wide range of scales and of geographies and of project types. So I've chosen a few to share with you tonight, really through the lens of joy. And I decided to kind of take a chronological view, starting with when I was a student, all the way to the work that we're doing today, through this kind of cross-cutting theme of joy. So starting then from my time as a student, as a graduate student in landscape architecture, where I began to work on a project that I still actually continue to work on, which is the Volunga Wharf in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. This is a site that historically was one of the largest slave ports in the Americas. So 22% of all of the Africans brought to the Americas via the transatlantic slave trade actually landed in the New World on this stone jetty. And it was covered over in the years since the abolition of slavery, but in the run-up to the World Cup and the Olympics and a lot of the infrastructure upgrades that were taking place, the stone jetty was uncovered 6 feet below the street level. So you can see that in this image that the street is about 6 feet up. So I, through the process of having a thesis project and receiving a grant as a student, I became embroiled in the real life project of designing a memorial at the site. And entering into this context, I took a step back and really questioned the idea of a memorial at this site. The typology and the tradition of the memorial in architecture comes from a tradition of monumentality that comes out of classical antiquity. And that tradition of monumentality is meant to demonstrate power. It's meant to overcome the human body in terms of scale and regulate use and tone of a space. And while the traditions of the memorial, the formal traditions of the memorial across time have changed, have evolved, and have had their different chapters, this kind of tradition of slowness, of quiet, of guilt, have really remained persistent throughout those chapters, all the way to the contemporary memorial and how we see it. Moreover, it's fashioned around the idea. The memorial is fashioned around the idea of a singular moment in time, you know, or a discrete person, you know, a battle. But slavery was not an event. It was 400 years of the way the world operated, and its effects are still present today. And when I took a look at some of the existing memorials to slavery, a lot of them co-opt the architectural form of those traditions in the previous slide. And so I really saw it as an opportunity to challenge how, you know, the limits as we see them of what a memorial is. And that started with this mapping of the site over 300 million years. So what you see on the left here is in black, the black dot across the three diagrams represents the site. And 300 million years ago, it touched the west coast, southern west coast of Africa, which means that it has, to this day, a similar soil profile and some of the same plants at the genus level. So this is a look at 150 years ago during the transatlantic slave trade. The light gray lines are the major trading routes, and you see the red lattice-solid tropical soils that bring the continents together. Some of the plant species actually traveled along the dark red and dark blue lines, which are the dominant oceanic currents, actually made the same journey as the enslaved Africans and landed on the coast of the Americas. So when the saying is that when the Africans arrived, that they noticed some of these plants, that they knew that their gods were present. So this is a view looking this is the view that the enslaved Africans would have had landing into the Volunga Wharf. So upon arrival, if you were sick on arrival, you were taken to this slave hospital to get a better price for you before your sail. If you might get free and try to form a community on the hilltops, a quilombo. Likely, or if you were dead on arrival, you were thrown in this burial ground. But if you were alive and relatively well, you'd be taken down this valley, this road that goes down the valley to this triangular plaza called the deposit, where you'd be tamed and fattened for 3 weeks before your point of sale at any one of these small plazas and streets. And what this kind of analysis demonstrates is the scale of the industry of enslaving humans, you know, that essentially in order to do that at the scale of millions of people, one has to construct an entire city. This particular city is called Rio de Janeiro, but this is the story of the formation of many cities in the Americas. So I took that analysis that you see at the bottom and compared that to the middle diagram, which is that of the contemporary city, and found that a lot of those spaces, the plazas, the buildings, they all remain there with no marker of that history. And so at the top is the land that the city itself owns. And so I took that to the city government and proposed that this memorial not be a wall with names or an object on a pedestal as the tradition of the memorial might suggest, but rather at the scale of the city, because the city itself is the memorial, and so that we might think about the memorial at the scale of that top diagram. So at this point, you're probably like, wait a minute, this is the Architecture of Joy presentation. And this is the interesting part of where joy comes into this project. You know, in the hundreds of years since, joy has really been a tool of resilience and of resistance. And so this page is kind of a diagram of, diagramming became a form of notation for me over the course of this project, of documenting the ways in which people have told this story in the absence of architecture telling its story, that through culture, through ritual, through joy, that those might be vessels for these stories. And that's how we know the experience of African people in the Americas. So each of these represents a different tradition of doing so. So this middle row takes the bodies and their movements in different musical traditions of Afro-Brazil. Enslaved people also brought the seeds of plants that were tied to rituals, tied to food, tied to medicinal practices. And because of that soil similarity, those plants hybridized and flourished in the American landscape. So this is documenting all of those to allow them to be a resource in the design process. So this is ultimately kind of the large kind of memory plan that that I proposed to the city, a kind of constellation of sites interwoven into the everyday life of the city. So broke them down into discrete capital projects, each of them integrating the plants and vegetation that were brought from by African people. So I'll go through a couple of these quickly. So zooming in on the archaeological site, here is the site itself. There's a obelisk to the Portuguese empress, which doesn't really have any relevance to the site. This was in conflict with the story of the people that the empire enslaved. And so activists really wanted to remove it. The city said no, or move it over. The city said no. So they asked me to design something taller so that we would win. But I really wanted to take the opportunity to mine, those traditions of joy and the tradition of storytelling, those traditions of power, of Afro-Brazilian power to be in dialogue in a different way, seeing as though this demonstration of power through height came from a very specific architectural cultural tradition. So we looked to the ficus genus, which is a genus that's native to both continents. And in fact, in Afro-Brazilian cosmology, the base of the tree is where the ancestors gather. And so there's a tradition of marking that with white walls. That pervades a lot of traditions that we still see today. And so this is a study of looking at how translating this kind of wrapping of fabric and wrapping of walls, wrapping it in white, could be translated into some sort of urban form and form a circulation system. And so what this became was the basis of the circulation system around the archaeological site. So you see these kind of the wrap taking the form of these circular forms that are related to the rituals that take place here in order to tell their story. So this is kind of a promenade that's made out of this white ribbon that allows those circular dance and song rituals to be anchored here in conversation with the archaeological site. And it, we're moving away from the archaeological site as a kind of box, and this blur form really this ribbon form allowing a blurring between the past, the present, and the future became a kind of device to think about the use of the space. So there's a series of kind of a suite of site furnishings designed with this idea of the white wrap. So I'll just kind of tap through some renderings from the various moments along the circuit, but you see how joy and anchoring people to the place becomes the memorial itself. The memorial is the kind of is the support and the fortification of these rituals into the future. So fast forwarding a few years, this was very early in the practice that I founded of Studio Zewde. This was in a neighborhood of Africatown. It's called the Central District in Seattle, the only historically African-American neighborhood in Seattle. And in the 1970s, it was almost 80% African-American, and today it's about 12%. So in some ways, you might think of it as displacement having been completed. And so we were commissioned by the Africatown Community Land Trust an organization that was really formed by the generation of people that witnessed the dismantling of the neighborhood. And they started to call the Central District Africatown as a way to, taking note of the fact that the adjacent Chinatown had not really seen the same levels of displacement. They theorized that perhaps the name could have some sort of mobilizing effect. And so we worked with them to envision what could Africatown look like. They started, as a land trust, started to purchase property and endeavored to design and build from the ground up Africatown, kind of envisioning a chapter after gentrification. So we had what we called design Cipher. So what you see here are images of design ciphers. It was a kind of a format of a charrette that really allowed us to rethink the format and offered people an entry point into the process. There's the word charrette coming from a tradition in hip hop of gathering in a circle. So one of the projects, a couple of small intervention projects came from this, public art projects. One was this project called Coming Soon. So this is a typical sign that you would see around the Central District. Coming soon, and new construction. There's a Porsche and joggers and kind of the demographics and aesthetic that the Central District isn't known for historically. So we decided to make our own Coming Soon signs. And so they were these, through the design ciphers, we started to imagine what would Africatown look like in a sort of futuristic, hypothetical sense. We worked with the same sign makers that a lot of the private developers do. And so we got permits from the city of Seattle to put these up around town. And what you see is logos of fake companies, all kind of under this fabrication that that this was going to happen. And that these are the businesses that would have to be constructed of people from Africatown, from the Central District, in order to design and build this place. So it was really fun to hang out in front of these Coming Soon signs because people, didn't really see the fiction. In fact, you would go to the website, and the only place where the reality was kind of pierced through to was on the events panel, where the events would actually be real life meetings of the Africatown Community Land Trust. So yeah, people were hanging out in front of these billboards, just, kind of asking themselves, wow, this is amazing. Is this going to happen? And, I would just stand there and say, yeah, it appears so. And so it actually became a really effective way to get people from the community engaged in what was possible. And so the renderings themselves took this style of Afrofuturism. And as I thought about the prompt of the architecture of joy, I see the ways in which really joy is at the heart of how this community was envisioning this either potentially real or potentially false future for themselves. And another project that came out of this was a temporary plaza installation. So this is the corner of 23rd and Union, which historically has kind of been the heart. It's been a really important Black cultural landscape, despite it being a parking lot. But for people that have been displaced from this neighborhood, they would drive 2 hours to come hang out in this parking lot. And Africatown Community Land Trust purchased the southern 20% of the site. So that's what you're seeing in this image. And they asked us, what could we do with a small budget? We don't have the financing yet to develop this, but we want to do something to get people engaged in the question of what this could be and what Africatown could be. So with 35,000 square feet to cover, we knew that paint was going to be our best friend. And so we had a design cipher just around this idea of this temporary plaza. Among the things that came from that was on the corner of 23rd and Union is a corner where you see it's actually known as the place where more Black men have been incarcerated for charges related to marijuana than any other place in Seattle. And since the decriminalization, the legalization of marijuana, this building now houses a dispensary. And so while the Black men still are incarcerated. So there was this desire to mark this corner as a kind of a place where people are welcome. And so there's an idea of making it a living room, and it was important to the folks of the community that we use concrete to design and build this outdoor living room at the corner. And concrete is not really a material you would associate with a temporary landscape. However, there was this sense that they said it directly, that that they can concretize their presence in the city of Seattle. So we worked with formerly incarcerated men from the neighborhood and trained them how to work with concrete. This is a skill that they actually would go on to use after this project in small landscape installation projects in the neighborhood. And we had a huge block party to actually paint all of this. We had over 300 people from the neighborhood painting with a DJ and barbecue. And there's a lot of pictures of really cute kids painting, and I always have to trim it down. And I just have to tell you, there's a lot of them. There's still tenants in the shopping center, and so it's still a parking lot. So I like to call this the most beautiful post office parking lot I've ever seen, but you see how we integrated the parking lot strips into this. So this is mid-installation of the living room. Got some plants in there. Had the mayor come out for a red ribbon cutting. This is before, and this is after. So we all of a sudden started to think that the architecture starts to look kind of African when you have this kind of scheme going on the ground plane. This is opening day. We had a huge potluck brunch where folks that have been displaced from the neighborhood were welcomed back, and everybody brought the dish that reminded them of the Central District the most. So, organizing a potluck of 300 people was not something I thought was part of the job description of being a designer, but I found myself doing that on this particular day. This is before, so this is the corner of 23rd and Union, and this is after. So you see the outdoor living room with the outdoor coffee table, a community coffee table. Folks submitted their favorite photos from the neighborhood, and we epoxied those photos onto the community coffee table. So it really became a coffee table, and a place actually became used as a stage, which was what it was designed for as well. So the space went on to have a life of its own. You see the kind of images epoxied at the top here. This is a market day. Joyful space, I would say, but really a similar theme as the other projects, that the use of joy as an act of resistance and resilience. So moving to 2018, this is a project for the Fairmount Park Conservancy, one of the largest parks in North America, in Philadelphia. This is a 22-acre site within that park, about 2 miles north of downtown Philadelphia. It's adjacent neighborhood of Strawberry Mansion, a neighborhood that is very joyful. You'll see some images of that. It also sees a lot of disinvestment, a lot of violence, a lot of vacancy, and a lot of unemployment. And this park has been the place to get away from all of that. So walking into the project, we heard so much about how this park saved my life. I learned discipline from my football coach or my mentor I met at the rec center. I had my first kiss here, all of those stories, and it really compelled us to reflect on the fact that, that this park deserves the kind of investment that resonates with the value that it provides for people's everyday life. And yet, when you look at the physical existing conditions, that is not the case. So our work is to bring those into union, the physical conditions of the site with the significance it holds for people. So our work here started with in a similar vein as many of our projects do, which is with a really robust research endeavor. In that process, we came across these archival images from the park and really reflected on the fact that people's connection to this place is about a generational connection. And so sharing these images with people really unlocked stories and more stories about their relationship to this place. For instance, one resident shared this poem with us. It says, "Now I have seen monuments, great geometric heaps of stone, lifeless towers raised to keep alive the dead. But I ask that cannot a monument that breathes be built?" And so, starting this project, that idea of a monument that breathes became a conceptual departure for the project. So we started our first community engagement without having anything drawn. And we learned that this community, this specific neighborhood, is known for its block parties. So we had a block party. We told our client that we didn't want to have any meetings. There would be no community meetings. We would only have events, and that would be our form of engagement. So we hired caterers from the neighborhood. We had, a t-shirt making. So, I Love Mander t-shirts. We hired MCs and rappers and poets from the neighborhood to perform about what they love about this place. And it was really a celebration of what this community is and of what the park is already. Before we start talking about changing it, before we draw a single line, let's celebrate what this place is today. And part of that celebration, we had these prompts around the party. I mean, this is really a party. People didn't know that they were at a community meeting for the most part. And so, but this was valuable input for us in the design process. At a certain point, the barbecue was switched out for aerial maps, and the 150 party goers were organized into 6 groups, randomized. You had to split up from who you came with, and come up with a collage with your group that articulates what you love about this place. And so it gave us a chance as the designers to embed ourselves in conversations that people were having between themselves, not just the community's coming and it's the community members versus the designers, but rather they are really working through this themselves. And they, each group sent a couple people to the front of the party to present. So we got to listen to the ways in which people articulated what was important. And we did these analyses of the 6 collages, not as a kind of one for one, but somebody put bike parking here, therefore we have to put bike parking there. Rather, we kind of were looking for the large strokes, the larger concentrations, orientation, program pairings, and so forth. And we're able to synthesize that into 3 design guidelines. First was activating this edge of the park relative to the residential neighborhood. Second was bringing people into the heart of the park. And third was creating a clear and legible circulation system within the heart of the space. So we were able to really clearly communicate throughout the process, come back to folks and say, is this the right understanding of what comes from those collages? Does this resonate? And here's how we've taken those 3 and designed a landscape with that at the heart of it. So what you see here is a kind of garden walk that welcomes people in from the northern stretches of the neighborhood, a kind of expanded plaza, really anchoring the ways in which people already gather on the southeast corner, a regrading of this landscape to form a sort of bowl around an amphitheater around the sports, which are so central to the community, which also doubles as a kind of picnic lawn, and really kind of reflects the idea of this being the heart of the community through the regrading and landscape. We developed what we called a memory plan in view of the fact that people shared so many memories with us, and that's why this place was so important to them. That we wanted it to be a clear registration of what was being designed as fortifications of those memories into the future. John Coltrane grew up on 33rd Street facing the park. And so they wanted to have a monument. So, you know, from my experience in Brazil that, you know, I tend to not default to thinking about monuments in particular ways. So this is my next stab at that, which was to look at this sketch on the left-hand side, which is the sketch that John Coltrane did of the mathematics of jazz music. And the translation of that became a paving pattern that stretched across the park along the hardscape areas. And what you see in this rendering is kind of a armature for inscriptions about people from the neighborhood, as well as a wayfinding device for folks kind of navigating that legible circulation system. This is a picnic grove. We heard a lot about family reunions being here. So we designed a whole stretch, that whole ring, what you see, this kind of shady ring around the lawn, the open lawn, is really being an entire stretch of picnic rows, of block parties, of family gatherings, of joy. If you like hip hop, you might recognize Meek Mill in this rendering, who is from the neighborhood, actually. And from the plaza, from that southeast corner, is, you know, you look out into this bowl, and from the plaza you see a water feature here, a scrim that has the words of the poem about the breathing monument inscribed below. So you're literally reflecting on the words of the poem. And as you look out into the bowl, then you know, are able to reflect on the fact that the community itself is the breathing monument. And then finally, a project that we're currently working on, well, Mander is also kind of underfoot, but Graffiti Pier started in concept phase started in 2019 or 2020, one of the two. I think it was 2019. And our client here was the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation. So this is a 6-acre waterfront park. This is Pier 18, this is Pier 20. And the site includes some of the upland areas as well. And similarly, our work here started with a robust research process and dating back the site to 8000 BC. And among the things that we found interesting were the fact that in the 1970s, as coal declines in the state of Pennsylvania, so too, at the same moment, is graffiti invented. And it's actually invented in Philadelphia. They love to remind us New Yorkers of that. So that brought sites like ours, like Graffiti Pier, into use as really important sites for evolving this new form of cultural production of graffiti and of street art. And that really was the case. The site remained a very, very well used and well known underground graffiti scene until 2010, when Instagram was invented, or I don't know what year it was invented, but that's when it really took off. And the site became the most Instagrammed spot in Philadelphia. So that became a liability for a client, or for Conrail, who owned the property. And they started to reach out to the city and to our client, the DRWC, to consider what the possibilities might be into making this some sort of publicly used space. So as you can imagine, graffiti writers were not really into this idea, because so much of the culture is about transgression, it's about anonymity. People are literally criminalized for their use of the site. And we wanted to be respectful of that. So we pitched a process of engagement that was twofold. One was really about engaging, a public engagement process that was about engaging adjacent residents, and another arm that was respectful of the fact that you know, of the lives of people in this scene. And so that was more covert, more under off the record. So we were meeting folks in bars, one-on-one. We had small group scenarios. We had representatives sent to us. We had anonymous emails and anonymous phone calls. And so these are a few of the images of the site. And this is an example of one of the places we found ourselves in this process. And among the initial conversations that we had with folks, we were often met with, why design anything? Why do anything here? Among the reasons why we shared with them was that, 25 years, the site will be inundated by high tide, not from store surge, but from the high tides. So this is the chance. Moreover, so there are pressures from the sea. There are also pressures from the land side, which is to say that urban development is encroaching on the site, and very soon there will be new condo development abutting the site. Actually, it's already changed quite a bit since we started the project, the adjacencies. So this is to say that this project is your chance to save Graffiti Pier. So we kind of reframe it as a Save Graffiti Pier project, and that really started to mobilize folks to get involved. So across the disparate conversations, we asked everybody one question. We said, what is the best thing that can happen here, and what is the worst thing that can happen here? And mapped out the responses across this graphic, and were able to identify some emerging themes. Right? So we came back to them and said, across the various conversations that we've had, we hear 4 themes: ensuring the continuation and expansion of art, keeping the site vegetated and passive, making it safe and accessible without looking safe and accessible, and keeping it gritty. So throughout the process, we were able to come back, similar to the Manda process, and share how the site plan was evolving with those 4 drivers really at the heart of that. So to give you an example, keeping it gritty, when we asked the graffiti writers, what does gritty mean? Their responses were things like, rocks and mud and plants and water. And we realized that the ecosystem of graffiti intersects with the historic intertidal ecosystem of this site. So we proposed to the client to remove the bulkheads and actually reintroduce an intertidal landscape here. And which is ecologically speaking, a pretty significant contribution to this portion of the Delaware River. And there's a few other elements of that. One is, creating a visual buffer between Pier 18 or Graffiti Pier and the kind of adjacent encroaching urban development, as well as offering a chance for the park and its uses and its vegetation to move upland and inland as the tides continue to rise. This is the site plan as of the end of the concept design phase. During the process, midway through the process, we actually took some early renderings to the graffiti writers. This is just before COVID hit, and so we were still doing things in person, and they actually tagged onto the renderings their feedback. And so we went through this process of decoding the graffiti or their tags and integrating that into our ongoing design process. So things like this train car art folly were new as a function of their feedback, but we're working through integrating those elements into things like biofiltration, as well as upgrading surfacing to make it ADA accessible, and some seating and so forth. So one of the features is this kind of green frame that there is already pioneering species on the structure itself, but we wanted to bolster that, given the kind of visual buffer that we needed now, to prepare for with the new urban adjacencies, urban development, and to make the plant palette itself more resilient and robust. We designed a suite of site furnishings that really borrow from the language of the Jersey barriers that are seen strewn across the site. and also, you know, designed to allow increased surfaces for graffiti and for street art. We found in the archives the drawings from the 1923 railings, which we loved. We thought they were beautiful, and we wanted to think about how we might, in view of, you know, one of the 4 guidelines being making it safe and accessible without feeling safe and accessible, thinking about how we could take these railings and design new railings that speak to this geometry, but are up to code. So you'll see that in some of the before and after renderings. So COVID hits during this process, and we find ourselves thinking about our engagement process, and we realize that, you know, graffiti writers are fellowshipping with one another, and they do so through zine making. So we made a zine with the graffiti writers called the Voices of Graffiti Pier, and they were going out to the pier and making graffiti and emailing us pictures, and we integrated that into this publication that shared the updated design drawings, and we had pre-stamped postcards in them so they could actually write or draw their final feedback and deliver it to us. So we gave graffiti writers a stack of them, and they could distribute among the networks. So I'll end here with a kind of a series of before and afters. This is before, and this is after. So you see a little bit of the green frame, the railings up to code, and the intertidal marsh here, and a new seawall. This is before, and this is after. So what we've done here is to really take a close look at where vegetation is already emerging, and in this case, we've redesigned that to be the area of bioretention swale, upgraded surfacing, again making this ADA accessible, but really thinking about ways in which this might appear to be a light touch. Despite the fact that there's a lot of infrastructure upgrades happening here, and actually a reshaping of the landscape in a significant way, but in the spirit of what's there. So this is before, and this is after, looking south to the through the southern trestle. So you see us, you know, kind of interpreting where the emergent vegetation is and designing planting beds in those areas and a plant palette that kind of corresponds to the character of what's there. So this is before. This is kind of the shady zone underneath one of the trestles, or on the side of one of the trestles, that we've reinterpreted into a shade garden. And you see the integration of our seating here as well. And this is before, and this is after. What you see here, this went through many iterations back and forth with the graffiti writers. You know, these are the remnants of the coal, and they just, you know, originally we were thinking to clean this up much more than what you see here. And they described the presence of coal on their clothes as something that was a really important part of their memory of the site. And so we kept it, and the client was totally on board with integrating all of that feedback. You do see the integration again of these planting beds and some shade trees and our site furnishings. This is before, so this is atop the trestle. People are already climbing on top of this thing, even though there's chunks of concrete flying off. And they said, whatever you do up there, don't make it the High Line. So we, in the spirit of making it safe and accessible without looking safe and accessible, we cut this ramp, ADA accessible ramp, into the concrete bed. And the planting here is grasses and sedums, and paths are gravel. And it's really, you know, that you've brought the railings up to code and really preserving the view and allowing people to do up there what they've always been doing, which is kind of just hang out and look. And then Pier 20, which is currently falling into the river, and so not used because of that. It's an opportunity to speak to that, one of those 4 design drivers, which was to expand the making and use of art. And so what we've done here, we're working with Sherwood Design Engineers, who is our civil, and to shore up, to actually create a new wall to the structure that's taller, so it can be used as an art wall, and, you know, is offering shoreline protection, but at the same moment is allowing some of the water to come onto the structure itself, and which offers the opportunity to engage in the rising tides. So here's a view of Pier 20. What you see here is that new seawall. You see some of the marsh planting and the opportunity for this new wall to be, these new seawalls to be, you know, kind of a place of dialogue between the street art and the rising tides. And again, having shored this up structurally means that this can now be used as a space of gathering. And I will end it there. As I mentioned, you know, this prompt of architecture of joy really brought together an interesting, for me, an interesting collection of projects and a different way of thinking about them. And so, you know, I appreciate that prompt, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really wonderful. It gave me a lot of ideas and things that we're doing now. But I'm going to turn it to Krista. Do you have some questions for Sarah?
Yeah, I just want to say I really appreciate how you incorporated the theme of joy through all these different works. And one of the things I really had a lot of fun hearing about was your approach to site analysis, and how you essentially throw a party every time you get a new project. And I love how you're secretly collecting the pieces to tell the story. And so I'm wondering, as you're gaining that information, that becomes a responsibility. So how do you prioritize what you use and what guides the design once you've collected all of that information?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it's definitely not iterative. I think what's tricky about presenting multiple projects in a few minutes is it seems like we like go to a party and then we like leave it and we have like, oh, these are the 3 things that are important and here's the design, which is like how it has to be presented. But it's about having a really robustly iterative process. We never get it right the first time. And that's where going back to folks and saying, here's what we think we heard, does that sound right? And then ultimately it changes and it warps and it shapes. But, you know, we've been able to craft that process. We've had wonderful clients that have invested in that process and encouraged us to trusted us really with that process. It's a deliberative one. It's a slow one. You know, it's not 3 minutes of presenting it. It's really, I mean, I've been working in Rio, like I said, since 2011 on, and so it's a back and forth. It's very much a dialogue.
Yeah, when you host those types of events, do you usually do them through your office, or are you working with your client as well? Or who will like fund that kind of stuff? You said it's usually potluck style, so people bring.
Or the early projects were potluck.
Yeah.
That's that now. So what we usually have is an advisory council that is made up of folks from the neighborhood. I kind of try to get a transect of folks, different ages, different parts of the neighborhood, to tap into what works, you know, what are the kind of rhythms of the place already, what are the existing events that we might, you know, anchor to, and so forth. And so we in all our proposals and so forth, where there's an engagement piece, we encourage that, because we can't know and we don't know everyone. We can't throw a party and like nobody would come, you know. So this advisory council structure has been really helpful for us.
Another thing that really stood out about your work is, even though you were going into these different neighborhoods and bringing improvements, there was still a sense of comfort and relatability with a lot of your projects. How would you say you keep that sense of local genius loci, but also bringing that improvement that is needed?
Yeah, I mean, I think your question kind of gets at the heart of what we're aiming for, which is it's a very careful navigation. And, you know, it sadly, most people who live in neighborhoods that are under threat of displacement associate improvement with with not being able to live in their community anymore, or with some sort of disruption. And I think that is a place that's not just their fault that they think that. I think that design itself, we should, as designers, be, challenging ourselves to design things that are speaking to some sense of familiarity, of comfort, of joy. But that is there's a specificity that's required, that we can't default to the aesthetics that we know about other places or traditions of other places. There isn't sort of a universal kind of normative approach to quote good design, but that there is a craft that is inherent to the question of design, and it is our responsibility to invest in that process, challenge ourselves to think expansively about what things look like, how they get built, so that they do resonate with people.
We've had a workshop recently on history and understanding design history, and one of the things that came out of that is that the most disenfranchised groups are disenfranchised because their history on the land is erased. It either doesn't exist, is not documented, or it's just not there. So when you talk about robust research, can you tell a little more about how you do the research and find the real stories of the land?
Yeah, I think precisely because of those challenges that you've referenced in terms of documentation, oral history is an important one. So talking to people, like designing those engagements to be places where we're able to have conversations, or literally go, we have a project in Tulsa and a park project. And so we were there on Mother's Day, and it was really, we walked around with 100 roses, and we walked door to door and gave them to mothers and asked about, their experience taking their children to the park. And just those one-on-one conversations unlocks so much in terms of not just their own experiences, but generations of history of a neighborhood and of a place where, the history books might not tell you, and the physical landscape may have likely been recast to obscure those histories. So we do the archival research, but we understand that there are holes, and we question them, but we want to know what's in those documents, what's in the books. And that's one layer and one chapter, and we layer that with also just observation of the place. And so when you start to layer all these different ways of knowing, and you kind of, look through them and try to see where the patterns are, you start to pick at things, and then you kind of do that round of checking with everyone to make sure what you think you see reflects how people know it to be.
That's the iterative process, is kind of feeding it back. So we have a question from Lou. Do you plan to keep the local artistic contributions current? So for example, will new graffiti artists paint over the existing work, or your benches or the walls? And is that just a free-for-all?
It's a great question. So actually, this happens every day on the site. Every day that place is different. And our efforts are towards keeping that tradition alive. So we don't see our work as preserving the art. Our work is to preserve the tradition of making art there. And so every day that'll change. The graffiti writers did ask that in the new park, and we are actually not using the word park, we're using the word publicly accessible space, because park means a thing. That is not what this is. But they asked that there be some sort of curatorial board, because in the real tradition, it's not that this is fake, but in the tradition of graffiti, there are rules that everybody knows and understands. For instance, if somebody is a very respected graffiti writer, then a person that is less respected is not allowed to put art over top that one, right? And so there are all these kinds of rules of the road that they all know and operate with. And so in this space, they asked that the operations and management of the space include a kind of governing board that ensures that these traditions, are maintained, despite the fact that really anyone is going to be able to come here now.
Interesting. Yeah. I also, I love the idea of a breathing memorial and a breathing idea, and taking and expressing the culture and making it alive instead of a dead kind of thing. Um, but a lot of people think of memorial, same thing with the Vietnam Memorial, they think of it as a thing. And so do you run across, like, we have several groups now that want to do something, and they're not educated enough to know what the options are. They want something as a commemorative, but not quite sure what it should be. And how do you deal with the people who want a thing versus something more expressive? I love that idea.
It's a tough question because the thing about memorials is they're so legible and didactic, and so there's something satisfying. I think not really to the people it commemorates. I would say it's probably unsatisfying for those people, but it seems an easy out in my view in some ways to think about a memorial as just an object, or and the landscape is the memorial. And so people, I think, want memorials when the landscape isn't doing what it's supposed to do in terms of reflecting a history and a presence of people. And memorials, that's not to say memorials shouldn't happen. They should happen. And there should be plaques, and there should be all of those things. It should be very clear. But that to me is only part of the project. We're working with a university right now about the question of their central quad, and there's all these questions about students and faculty and notions of belonging in an academic campus, and the design of a landscape of a campus really borrowing from this notion of borrowing from European academic institutions as expressions of intellect and of advancement. And so how do you take the model of an academic campus and a quad, for instance, or all the other kind of landscape components related to a campus, and think about them, not just put a memorial there, but think about designing them to become places that are reflective of the people that are coming here to learn and to teach.
We have another question. Do your clients build on the experience that the neighborhood had during designing? It could be an empowering experience.
Yeah, we had a project in this reservoir project for Outward Bound and for the Audubon Society. Their office is held in a reservoir that used to be a community asset. So we had a reunion with the reservoir event, and during COVID, this neighborhood saw a lot of deaths related to COVID, and so we had a community vigil at the reservoir as an engagement event. And that event is now an annual event, and it's allowed the client to form a new relationship with its adjacent community. That's kind of the example that comes to my mind immediately. But I think in a lot of ways, these neighborhoods are so resilient, and they're the ones telling us about how to engage them. Mm-hmm. And so these traditions of gathering predate us, and they'll go on without us. And sometimes our clients, through us, get a peek into how to kind of move in those rhythms as well.
Krista, any other?
Yeah, I had a question for Sara. Since you were sharing how what people see as the tragedy of Hurricane Katrina kind of inspired your trajectory in your career, how would you encourage this current group of students in architecture and landscape architecture who are coming out of what feels like the tragedy of the pandemic to give fire and momentum to their future careers?
That's a really good question. The challenges are different. The field itself is also very different. 2005, this is like landscape architecture. There's like discourses of landscape urbanism, and really heavy on the kind of ecology. There's a lot of like parametricism happening. And so despite my coming to the field with those interests, honestly, I was interested in landscape architecture despite itself. It wasn't much that I thought like actually connected, but I did see in it the possibilities of the skill set that it offered. That these skills could be applied to in a certain way. So fast forward to 2022, 17 years, is that right? 17 years later. Basically, it's kind of, the field has changed. It changed a lot in the last 2 years, since, over the course of the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd. And I think it's changed in some good ways, and maybe, in other ways I think should still grow. But I think it's a much more diverse field in terms of people's interests and what they think is possible with the skill set. So I think people entering into the field now, there's just there's a greater tolerance for having different entry points into the profession. So I always tell my students, when they complain about how they think the field is so narrow, I'm just like, you haven't seen where we come from. It's 17 years. Imagine, with your efforts, where we could be in 17 more. I think that, or beyond, really. I mean, I think 165 years, this profession was started 165 years ago with the design of Central Park. And we, I think, haven't made the contributions to the society and the kind of bigger questions that I think of the profession can, and that Central Park and Olmsted's legacy would suggest are possible. But I'm still hopeful that we can.
It seems like there's a lot more stories to be told and layers to be uncovered and revealed within our landscape. So I think that's really inspiring. Thanks for sharing.
Robin is asking, has Black Lives Matter created more openness to non-majority visions of neighborhoods and public space?
It's a good question. I'm a little bit of a pessimist on this particular question, I have to say, because I'm very sensitive to the limits of symbolism, and which on the one hand, I just presented an hour-long presentation of symbols. On the other hand, I only think those symbols are important insofar as they are parallel to really integral to systematic change. And so, I think sometimes that the energy that has come from the last 2 years since the murder of George Floyd, and the many more years of Black Lives Matter, not many more, but a few more years of Black Lives Matter discourse, I struggle to see the real systemic change that's tied to that. And so where it feels like there's more openness to some of those visions, I'm still a little bit, I think we need, it deserves a lot more. I was looking at an old presentation when I was putting this one together, and I had a slide from this poet, and he says that white supremacy is not the shark, it is the water. And that kind of sense that this is our environment in a major way. And this is the world that we live in. And so making sure that those discourses of Black Lives Matter and a seeming openness to change, what is really at hand, what is really the task here, is at the forefront of my mind about change,
Well, along those same lines, the projects you presented were pretty progressive in terms of just dealing with real subjects and people and expressing the real people who are there, not trying to erase them. How do you find your clients, or do they look for you? Are you finding more clients? I mean, how does that work, that you've had that opportunity even?
So you know, I would say maybe half of our projects are us responding to RFPs. And we are specific about which RFPs we're going to respond to if we see an opening in the way the RFP is written. Otherwise, yeah, clients that come to us kind of know what they're getting into a little bit.
Yeah,
You
well,
know?
that's what I wonder. Are you getting more people coming to you, or is it growing, this kind of approach?
I think so. I mean, we are growing from 8 to 14 in the people in our office, and we are having to be selective about our projects in order to manage the rate of growth of our office. And you know, I suspect that as things get built, not just by us, but as you know, kind of my contemporaries who are working in similar ways, that people that might resonate about, you know, what the potential of this kind of approach might be, and perhaps it might sway things in the long run.
You might mention, when did you open your office? It's not that old.
No, formally, 2018 was when we realized
So that's pretty remarkable. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Krista?
I had one other question, and I was listening to another webinar recently where it talked about like how do you make impacts in the landscape, and it was, you know, sometimes you have to think smaller and cheap, but like, and then for example, like when you go in and did that parking lot project where you're, you know, painting the asphalt and doing changes like that, and sometimes you have to go in and make smaller gestures. But how do you, I guess, if you have an approach where you just want to make some change, how do you still maintain and make sure there's a level of quality so that the space can continue?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about landscape architecture. It's like we're talking about these big, you know, we're talking about 300 million years of, you know, continents moving in the case of the Brazil project. And then, you know, I'm detailing a handrail, you know. And for me, that's what I love about it, because I think those things matter. I think that having a place to sit in the shade, you know, in a comfortable place in your community, and, you know, and have a place to come together with the people that, you know, with whom you formed this bond over years, this resilience over generations, no matter who you are, that is, you know, that is really what we need to, in order to be resilient. That's joy. That's what joy is. And so for me, it's those small measures are really, you know, there's really important, smart people working on policy, and really brave people working in community organizing,